Do you know what time they had their last drink? I'd say it was probably between 6 and 6:30. Brian told nearly everyone that he left around 7 or 7:30. Three sources: a bartender with 20 years of experience, a fisherman sending a photo to his mother, and a security camera that captured Lynette Hooker's final minutes at the Abaco Inn. Together, they reveal a single piece of information about when Lynette and her husband left that afternoon of April 4th. Brian has been telling a different story. The version he gave most people is that he left around 7 or 7:30. The gap between the two stories is 1 hour, and that hour could turn out to be the most crucial detail in this entire case. This video reports on an ongoing investigation. No one has been formally charged in the disappearance of Lynette Hooker. Brian Hooker has denied any responsibility for what happened. What follows is a detailed analysis of the public record. Lynette Hooker, 55 years old, mother, grandmother, and a sailor for more than a decade. Her husband Brian, 58 years old, 25 years married, with a yacht named Soulmate, anchored in the Sea of Abaco. A Saturday dinner on Abaco Inn in the Bahamas, a boat ride that was supposed to take them back to their vessel, and then emptiness. Lynette gone. Brian washing ashore at a boatyard in Marsh Harbor around 4 o'clock the next morning. A multi-mile rowing trip according to him. An engine that died because in his version, she had the key when she fell into the water. The boat key went down with her because it wasn't tethered to anything or to any person. And on top of that, she had the spare key in her dry bag. No life jackets and no distress calls from open water. You already know the details of the search. You've heard Brian's statements, the ones his friends repeat, and that appear in the recorded calls played on the podcast. You heard Lynette's mother describe the relationship as a cycle of ups and downs, warning that Brian became cruel and hateful when he drank. When Brian drank, Brian could be cruel, hateful, and say very nasty things. And that sums him up well. He also got physical at times. You heard Carly Ellsworth, Lynette's daughter, say on camera that Brian's account simply doesn't make any sense. You know about the questioning in the Bahamas, the arrest, the release without charges, and the statements where Brian says he loves his wife and can't forgive himself. What you haven't seen yet is this direct comparison of what happens when you take three key pieces of evidence, obtained from independent sources, and place them next to the version Brian Hooker himself gave about the start of that final trip. Because the version he told, the one he has repeated to his friends in recorded conversations, the one reflected in police statements, and the one several news outlets have reported, places their departure from the Abaco Inn between 7 and 7:30 in the evening. That time frame is the most vital detail in his testimony. Almost everything else hinges on it. Every calculation of how long Lynette was in the water or how far the current carried her. Every scenario for why Brian didn't reach dry land for hours. The questions about weather, light, and wind all assume the two of them set out from the hotel dock right as the day was ending. The evidence you're about to see suggests they left an hour earlier than Brian claims. And if that's the case, the entire sequence people have been trying to reconstruct for 2 weeks starts to fall apart completely. Before we get to the time problem, there's the person at the center of all this and the people who loved her deeply. This context matters because the timeline isn't abstract. Every minute belongs to a real evening, a real bar, a real flesh and blood couple, and a real woman who hasn't been seen since. Lynette Hooker grew up around water. Her social media, in the years before the Bahamas trip, documents a life organized around boats, voyages, harbors, and long stretches on the open sea. Her Instagram and Facebook profiles in the public portions, reviewed by CNN and other outlets, read like a sailing journal. On March 29th, 6 days before she disappeared, she posted a video of Marsh Harbor in the rain, joking that the Sea of Abaco was entertaining and that the group would have a good time once the weather finally cleared up. She was very active online. She was a grandmother. She was 55 years old, and according to her mother on the podcast Drop Dead Serious, she was planning to end her marriage. The fact that she had left him so many times before and kept going back even after being physically hurt, that was something I found extremely difficult to understand. That detail, the plan to leave him, has become one of the most emphasized pieces of context surrounding this criminal case. Lynette's mother described on camera a pattern of instability over the 25 years her daughter spent with Brian. Ups and downs, breakups, followed by reconciliations and accusations of cruelty and hatred whenever Brian drank too much. The mother stated there had been physical incidents and that for a long time she had genuinely feared for her daughter's safety. That testimony belongs to the mother and it has been disputed by Brian's inner circle. It deserves to be reported faithfully and attributed to the person who said it, just as journalist Banfield did. Carly Ellsworth, Lynette's daughter, was the first family member to publicly question Brian's account. In her early interviews, she simply said, "His words didn't add up. Nothing makes sense. My mother is a very strong, athletic woman. She's a great swimmer. So why would she swim away from the boat? It doesn't make any sense. Why did she have the key? Honestly, his story just doesn't add up for me." She has held that position firmly over the past few weeks. And she was one of the 2 family members who sat down with the manager of the Abaco Inn to personally review the surveillance footage. Her role in the public narrative of this case became central, and not just because she's family, but because she's one of the few people who was physically at the exact location where the evidence we're about to discuss lives. That's the human face behind the numbers. A woman who was deeply loved. A woman who was planning a change. Someone who never came back from a short trip across waters she already knew well. Now the data. Ken Sweeting has been the one pouring drinks at the Abaco Inn for 20 years. 20 years at the same bar and the same patio, watching families pass through on the same routes. He's the kind of bartender who remembers his customers. He's the type who memorizes every drink. When a customer orders something very specific, he prepares it exactly the same way every time. That's how you keep a job for 20 years at a small island hotel where guests arrive by boat and leave word-of-mouth recommendations behind. When journalist Ashley Banfield sat down with him to record his official statement on this case, Sweeting clearly told her what he remembered serving Brian and Lynette Hooker that Saturday afternoon. He ordered 2 rum and Cokes 2 Cuba Libres. I served white rum soda and lime. I gave them 2. They went off to eat and he carried them over toward the pool. He remembers the couple perfectly. He remembers them at the bar, and he remembers their order. Sweeting says he served them 2 full rounds. 2 rounds, 4 drinks total. He ordered Cuba Libres twice. The last round, the final drinks, he served them somewhere between 6 and 6:30 in the evening. That's his official version on camera and in front of Banfield. Banfield pressed him on whether the time could have been later or whether the hookers stuck around and ordered another round, but Sweeting was firm. They didn't order anything else. Do you know what time they had their last drink? It was probably between 6 and 6:30. 6 to 6:30, yes, more or less. Enough time to finish their drinks, let's say, by 6:35. Yes, or if they got it at 6:30, they would have been done by 7. His account places them at the end of their visit. He's basically telling us that by then the evening at his bar was winding down. So when did that window actually end? What time did they definitively leave? To know that we need a second source. There's an additional detail in the interview with Sweeting that we need to remember because it'll come up again later. Sweeting did not describe the couple as drunk. He didn't say they were arguing. He didn't mention any scene at the bar that caught his attention, at least not the way a bartender notices something off. 2 Cuba Libres, spread across 2 rounds, over the course of an entire afternoon, does not represent, by any reasonable measure, an amount of alcohol capable of incapacitating an average-sized adult. He described them as a couple having dinner and drinks quietly at the bar. Saturday afternoon, I'd estimate around 4:30. The gentleman came up to the bar. His wife went straight down to the pool. I really didn't see her or talk to her. She just walked past. It was a busy afternoon. A local named Joe, identified only by his first name to protect his privacy, was at the Abaco Inn that Saturday evening. He's a fisherman. He was there to have dinner and spend a little time by the pool that evening. And at one point during his visit, he did something that millions of people do every day. He took a picture of the pool to send to his mother. A nice image of a beautiful place, a scene he wanted to share. His mom had texted him, and he stepped out taking advantage of how beautiful the evening was. He took a photo of the pool, the waves, and the wind to send her. He took 2 photos, actually. One looks better when you focus on Brian. His tattoo shows up more clearly there. But it wasn't until the next day that Joe realized, wait a minute. I think I have a photo of them, and the timestamp reads 6:34 p.m. When Banfield's team reviewed that image obtained directly from Joe and verified through the metadata on his phone, 2 things stood out. The first was the image itself. The pool area at the Abaco Inn, lit by an afternoon sun that was still high. The colors are vivid, the shadows short, it's still broad daylight. And in the background of that shot, visible but present, are 2 figures who have been identified as Brian and Lynette Hooker. The second thing Banfield's team found was the time. Phones record the exact moment of a capture, down to the minute and almost always the second. Joe's timestamp on that photo reads 6:34 p.m., 6:34, 4 minutes after the last drink. Just 4 minutes after, according to Sweeting Alcohol, stopped being served to Brian and Lynette. And there they are, not carrying any bags, not even walking toward the water. In no rush to leave the pool, just hanging around. That photo on its own doesn't answer the question of when they left. It answers a different question. It confirms exactly the moment they were still there. And it does so with a piece of evidence that doesn't depend on anyone's memory. The time is mechanical, the image is archived, and the metadata is intact. It confirms what Sweeting said, that Brian and Lynette were still at the Abaco Inn past 6:30. The photograph also offers something the bartender's memory can't, which is an image of what the couple looked like at that exact moment. They're not on the boat or at the dock. They're by the pool, with a vibe that tells anyone who stayed at a hotel that they were still relaxed. No bags. No hurry, no sign in the frame that they thought they were minutes away from boarding a small boat to cross the water. If that's the posture of someone about to leave, then they were planning to leave in the next few minutes. If it's the stance of someone still enjoying the place, then they weren't planning to leave yet. Either way, it's a posture that clashes with the story that they pulled away from the dock under fading twilight an hour later. For the next question, what happened after 6:34, we have to look at the camera on the wall. The Abaco Inn, like most modern hotels operating in tourist areas, has security cameras throughout the property. That footage isn't public. It typically isn't released, and it hasn't been turned over to Banfield's team. What did happen instead, and this distinction needs to be made clearly, because it affects the weight this record carries in the case, is that the manager of the Abaco Inn agreed to let certain family members of Lynette Hooker view portions of the footage on site. They were allowed to watch, but they were not allowed to make copies. They weren't allowed to record the monitor with their phones, and they couldn't take anything away with them except what they were able to remember. The Royal Bahamas Police Force is being extremely strict and very tight-lipped about this. They're not allowing the manager of the Abaco Inn to release the video, not even to Carly Lynette's daughter. Carly Ainsworth is Lynette Hooker's daughter. Her partner, Steve Hansen, was with her on that visit to Elbow Cay. Together, they reviewed the part of the video the manager allowed them to see. Then they told Banfield on the record what they remembered. Their account, and I want to stress that this is an account, not a copy of the recording, and that distinction has to be emphasized, is that the video showed Brian and Lynette Hooker leaving the Abaco Inn property at around 6:38 p.m. 6:38. 4 minutes after Joe's photo, 8 minutes after Sweeting closed out their bar tab, a sequence that viewed together is remarkably consistent. Last drinks between 6 and 6:30 photo by the pool, at 6:34 surveillance, at 6:38. 3 independent records, 3 different sources. The memory of a bartender, the cell phone of a fisherman, the family's reading of a camera's clock, all converging within the same 8-minute window, all telling the exact same story. And that story says Brian and Lynette Hooker left the Abaco Inn at around 6:45, not at 7, not at 7:15, and not at 7:30. The surveillance detail specifically requires caution, and that caveat needs to be mentioned. What Carly and Steve remember is not the same as the video itself. Memory fails. The time on a screen can be off by several minutes. They didn't have a second clock to cross-reference. If anyone disputes that 6:38 reading, and it's possible resolving it will require the original video, which remains in the Abaco Inn's custody. Whether the Bahamas investigators have reviewed that footage frame by frame and compared its internal clock to available phone records isn't yet public knowledge. But when 3 independent sources line up within an 8-minute window, the weight of the evidence shifts. This is no longer about simple coincidences, it's a clear pattern. Brian Hooker has spoken about April 4th. He has done so to the police, and also to his closest friends. Some of those private conversations were recorded by the person on the other end, and several excerpts have already been played on the podcast. In those recordings, and in his official statement to the Royal Bahamas Police Force, and in reports by CNN, Fox News, CBS, and local outlets in Michigan and the Bahamas, Brian maintains that the couple left the Abaco Inn between 7 and 7:30 in the evening. That time frame holds across all of his accounts. The Bahamian police have publicly mentioned a time of 7:30. A widely circulated timeline attributes 7:30 p.m. to police reports. According to authorities, Lynette and Brian Hooker departed Hopetown in their 8-foot boat, heading toward Elbow Cay. Brian himself, in audio recorded for the podcast, has insisted they left very late that day. "We stayed too long. We left way too late in the dark. A chain of mistakes." Those are his words, not mine. Sunset on April 4, 2026 in the Abaco Islands was at 7:42 p.m. If Brian and Lynette set off in their boat at 7:30, they did so with light that was already dying, with darkness closing in fast. That detail is no minor thing. It's the foundation of Brian's explanation. In his own version, the reason they ended up surfacing at 4 in the morning at a distant boatyard is that they left far too late that night. The light was fading, and the sea looked much choppier than it had earlier. Lynette fell, he didn't see her, and the engine died because she had the key. He drifted rowing until he reached shore hours later. Every part of that story rests on the idea that the trip began at the end of the day. What these three independent sources suggest is that the trip in fact did not begin at the end of the day. It began in full daylight. At 6:40 in the evening, the sun was still a full hour above the horizon. The channel between the dock and the anchorage was well lit. There would have been other boats out there at that time. Other people would have had eyes on that stretch of the Sea of Abaco. There's a lot of light between 6 and 7. On the clock, it's 50 minutes. But in terms of visibility, sea conditions, and potential witnesses, that span of time is everything in this case. Someone is wrong about when they left the Abaco Inn. Who and why is what investigators are now analyzing. Before we go any further, if you're someone who follows this case without missing a single technical detail, please consider subscribing to the channel. We follow these crimes week after week, and it's thanks to subscribers that we're able to bring you these in-depth investigations. Let's get back to what that lost hour does to his account. Brian said he made it to shore at 4 in the morning. That's a detail no one disputes. Steve Smith described that encounter to Fox News, Digital, and other outlets shortly after it happened. When Brian appeared on that small beach full of sharp rocks, he was exhausted and completely soaked. He apparently had been in the water for hours. If we start counting from 7:30 in the evening, the interval from that departure to his arrival at the boatyard at 4 in the morning is 8.5 hours. Several captains who know these waters well have publicly said that this interval is suspiciously long and implausible. The trip the couple was making that night was actually short, just a few nautical miles from the Abaco Inn to where their yacht was anchored. The distance from Hopetown to where Brian washed up in Marsh Harbor is roughly 8 miles by water. Under normal current and wind conditions, even with a broken engine and rowing in a small boat, local captains say that drift would take a couple of hours, not all night. That length of time requires an explanation. Brian gave one. He talked about rough seas, a broken engine, and rowing hard against the current. The reports about the weather that night differ, and that's a dispute worth detailing. Volunteer rescuers from Hopetown recorded winds of 18 to 22 knots that night due to a cold front that produced intense gusts toward the coast. The commander of the Royal Bahamas Defense Force, Orion Delaveau, called the weather at the start of the search extremely serious. On the other side of the coin, Captain Ronnie Duncan, a local boater officially interviewed by Banfield, offered a different version. He challenged Brian's description of the sea, stating that the Sea of Abaco doesn't usually get that rough, not unless there's a major storm right on top of it. And it's not even realistic. I can't say it was a 3-foot swell. No way. But he kept insisting there were 2 to 3-foot waves. Right? No, he's talking about open ocean swell. But what we're looking at here is considered the Sea of Abaco. Things don't get that bad here unless there's a really strong wind blowing. A storm, a northeaster, or something like that. What's not in dispute is that the current in that channel doesn't usually keep a boat drifting in place all night. Now let's subtract 50 minutes from the start of this count. If the departure was at 6:40 and not 7:30, the time between the departure and the arrival at the boatyard is no longer 8.5 hours. It's 9 hours and 20 minutes. Almost 9.5 hours of drift when local captains estimate the entire trip shouldn't take more than a few hours. In none of the published interviews with captains experienced in these waters, does anyone say that a drift across that particular stretch of the Sea of Abaco would take 9.5 hours under any realistic conditions. That's the first big math problem when you try to move the departure time earlier. The earlier you mark the departure, the more time the boat spends adrift. And the more time that passes, the harder it becomes to sustain an explanation that's already pretty questionable. The second problem is worse. If you leave at 6:40, you're leaving in broad daylight. The sun is still high. The channel between the hotel dock and the yacht anchorage is perfectly visible. There were almost certainly other boats moving through the area at that time. Visibility on the water depends on sight, not instruments. If Lynette went into the water in the first 20 minutes between 6:45 and 7, she did so still in sunlight. In waters that local rescuers describe as shallow and crystal clear. Pete Calling is another official source mentioned in this complex criminal case. He led a team of volunteer firefighters in the search. He knows those waters personally because he has sailed them many times. In his interview with Banfield, he described the area as a shelf of shallow, extremely translucent water. Water so clear, he said that you could see the bottom perfectly from the surface. Under normal conditions, bodies are not easily lost in waters where you can count the coral from the deck of your boat. That's why if Lynette went into the water in full daylight in such a busy and visible channel, the logical explanations for why she vanished are drastically reduced. And if she didn't fall in that channel, or at that hour, if the story has a geographical flaw on top of a timing problem, then we're not just talking about a departure time that doesn't match the evidence presented by investigators. We're talking about a version of that night that contradicts physical evidence in more than one fundamental way. There's one more factor in moving the departure to broad daylight, and it might matter more than any minute on a clock. The first Saturday in April in the Abaco Islands is the heart of peak boating season. The waters off Hopetown and Elbow Cay weren't deserted that night. It was one of the most crowded anchorages in all of the Bahamas. Social media posts from other sailors who were there that night, some contacted by local press, describe a very different scene. They describe the harbor and the surrounding channels as completely packed with anchored vessels. Boats were moving between the yachts and the shore. People were eating dinner on deck and watching the evening light start to fall. There were a lot of eyes on the water looking carefully in every possible direction. If you head out at 7:30, in a small, rigid-bottom boat, as it gets dark, you become just one of dozens of vessels in the harbor. You're on the water, but you don't stand out. Nothing about your route necessarily catches anyone else's attention. But if you head out at 6:40 in afternoon light from the dock of a famous hotel on a shoreline that gets photographed constantly, you're in plain view. Tourists, taking pictures of the pool the way Joe did. People photographing their own boats, their cocktails, and that prime ocean view. Plenty of others were watching from the decks of nearby yachts. If anything unusual happened in that small boat in the channel, a fall or a visible struggle on the surface of the water, the probability that another sailor, a phone, or a witness would have noticed it is significantly higher. That's why the departure time isn't simply a matter of what the clock says. It's about how many cameras, how many eyes, and how many phones were aimed at the Sea of Abaco at the precise moment Lynette Hooker disappeared without a trace. It's a question of how many people were watching the water that night. The earlier that window opens, the more likely it is that someone saw something. They didn't realize what they were seeing at the time. That's why these three sources are crucial. That's why the bartender's 20 years matter. That's why Joe's photo to his mother is vital. That's why the Abaco Inn's recording, when it's turned over and matched against the other evidence, in this case, could be the most important piece. This evidence has to be examined very closely. To understand what leaving in daylight actually means, picture what Hopetown Harbor really looks like. At 6:40 p.m., on a clear Saturday in April, the Abaco Inn sits beside Elbow Cay. The dock faces the Sea of Abaco with the main yacht anchorage right across the water. On any peak season afternoon, that spot holds dozens of vessels. Some are charter boats. Others are private yachts or belong to sailors who travel through the Bahamas depending on the time of year. Radio traffic on VHF Channel 68 ramps up as the evening sets in. Sailors plan dinners, coordinate boat shuttles, and share weather updates. Sunset in Abaco is a sacred ritual. I'm not exaggerating. Everyone plans their evening around the daylight. Many people raise a toast on deck while the sun dips below the horizon. That means dozens, sometimes hundreds of eyes facing west, scanning the same stretch of water. Brian and Lynette would have had to cross this stretch to reach their own yacht. If a boat from the Abaco Inn crossed that channel at 6:40 p.m. on April 4th, it didn't go unnoticed. It passed in front of a harbor full of people. That's just the nature of that place. Not everyone would have been paying attention, and not every person on deck would have been taking pictures of that channel. But the chance that someone noticed a small boat is far from negligible. Someone may have seen it at an unusual time, or noticed a fall, a struggle, or the boat coming to a stop. That's why the Banfield team's decision to recreate the boat's route carries so much investigative weight. Witnesses who didn't realize they were seeing something relevant might, with reflection, recall a key detail. The press is reaching out to those witnesses. The Bahamas investigators, if they're doing their job right, should be looking for them too. 4 data points, 4 independent sources, 3 of them, the bartender, the photograph, and the recollection of the surveillance video line up within an 8-minute window. The 4th, Brian's account, falls outside that window by nearly an hour. There are few explanations for a discrepancy like this. They're worth examining very carefully. The truth is not all the explanations point in the same direction. The first possibility is that the 3 sources are right and Brian's memory is wrong. It's possible that after a traumatic night, a person's sense of time is off by an hour. We don't carry precision clocks in our minds. If Brian internalized that the trip happened around sunset, and has repeated that same version to friends and to police, he probably actually believes it. The problem with that explanation is that Brian has told the same story in very different settings. It's not a casual remark, it's a specific time. Getting it wrong once is believable. Being off by nearly a full hour, consistently across multiple conversations, is much harder to believe. The second option is that Brian's memory is accurate, and the 3 independent sources are wrong. That would mean Sweeting's memory, the phone's record, and the surveillance clock all failed. That's asking a lot. Phone records don't lie. A veteran bartender remembers how an evening went. And while a witness watching a monitor can be off, they'd have to be off by nearly an hour for Brian to be right. The fact that all 3 sources line up makes this explanation almost impossible to sustain. The third possibility is that Brian is giving a departure time different from the one he knows is real. Why he would do that is something for the authorities to investigate. It's not our place to assign a motive. That possibility is on the table, and it can't be dismissed just because it's uncomfortable to bring up. Serious investigators evaluate every scenario the evidence allows for. That includes the scenario where a witness has reasons to describe events less than accurately. The 4th possibility is some combination of the previous 3. A memory error on Brian's part, a misreading of the surveillance clock, and fuzzy recollections from the bartender. This is the most accommodating explanation. But even if we shave 20 or 30 minutes off each end, we still end up with a departure time, much earlier than the one Brian has described, under conditions with much more daylight and on water more crowded than he himself has recounted. The core of the problem doesn't go away. The pattern has one feature that makes it unusually hard to ignore, and that's that the 3 converging sources come from very different types of evidence. One is the human memory of a trained professional with decades of experience recognizing patterns. Another is mechanical metadata from an electronic device and a security timestamp verified by 2 witnesses. Those 3 categories don't fail in the same way. A bartender's memory can fade or get distorted. A clock can be off. A recording can fail. But all 3 failing in the same direction is a pattern impossible to ignore. Which explanation is the right one isn't something a narrator decides. It's something the investigation has to prove. The question for investigators and the public is which of these 4 options survives once the surveillance footage is formally obtained, properly synced, and matched against Joe's phone and Sweeting's testimony. If the video confirms 6:38, Brian's account collapses on pure physics, not on interpretation. You can't leave at 6:38 in the evening and arrive at the boatyard at 4 in the morning without explaining that time. You can't describe a departure at nightfall, when the sun was still a full hour above the horizon. It's not possible to describe rough seas and low light when setting out when the day was still bright and clear. Investigators in the Bahamas know this. Lynette's family knows it. And if Brian Hooker has lawyers, and given the magnitude of this case, he almost certainly does, his lawyers know it too. What comes next in Lynette Hooker's case will depend on a few mechanical, very concrete steps. The Bahamas police will or will not obtain the surveillance footage from the Abaco Inn for the night of April 4th. The clock on that footage will or will not sync with other time sources within the same property. The timestamp on Joe's phone will or will not be entered into the record as corroborating evidence. Ken Sweeting's account will or will not be documented as a formal witness statement. The observations of Carly Aylesworth and Steve Hansen will be treated as useful context rather than as simple family frustration. This case has already produced 1 arrest during its time in the Bahamian legal process. There has already been a release without charges within the legal window allowed for holding a suspect before formal charges. Brian Hooker has been consistent in saying he did no harm to his wife. that he loved her, and that these days without her have been the hardest in the 25 years they were together. Those are his statements, and it's fair that they belong to the official record of this case. The public record in this case so far includes no formal charges against Brian. That has to be said with absolute clarity. But what the public record does include now is a growing body of evidence that his version of the departure does not match what the bartender saw or what's on the fisherman's phone, much less what the Abaco Inn camera appears to have captured that evening. That discrepancy is the thread investigators are finally in a position to keep pulling on. There are concrete investigative steps this evidence suggests, and they really are worth mentioning now. By doing so, the public can gauge whether the investigation is being conducted with the seriousness this case deserves. The full surveillance footage needs to be turned over, not just the short clip the family was allowed to see. The internal clock of the Abaco Inn system has to be cross-referenced with at least one verifiable external time source, such as a cell tower record or another camera on the property with an independent clock. Joe's phone needs to be analyzed by a forensic expert to confirm that the metadata wasn't altered. That includes confirming whether the clock was correct. In addition, Ken Sweeting's account needs to be a formal statement. That should include follow-up questions about every moment of the evening, who arrived first, and how long they spoke with the staff. Whether either of them stepped away from the bar area during their stay, or if they spoke with other patrons present. The testimony of Carly Aylesworth and Steve Hansen about the video has to be measured against what the actual footage shows, so that human memory is tested against the mechanical record. These aren't exotic or unusual steps. It's basic investigative work. In the United States, this would be standard practice in the early stages of a serious missing persons case. How the Bahamian process handles a case file of this size and visibility is something the public will be watching closely. A parallel set of questions is emerging about the boat itself and the route Brian claims to have taken that night. In addition to the sea conditions recorded by local weather stations on the night of April 4th, it comes down to whether other vessels near the Hopetown anchorage had transponders whose logs would place them near the relevant channel. Those questions are not the central focus of this production, but they are tied to our investigation, and they will be crucial to the final reconstruction of what happened that night. Lynette Hooker remains missing. Her family continues to search. Her mother is still waiting for the answer that simply never comes at a press conference. No matter what the authorities in the Bahamas decide next, the version of events presented to the public now stands face-to-face with evidence that completely contradicts the official account. And evidence that doesn't support a story has over time a way of reshaping and changing that account. If you've been following this case, don't go anywhere. New facts are entering the official record almost every day. Those who have worked the case from the start, reporters, family members, and neighbors who knew the couple, aren't giving up. Neither are we. And if you want to follow closely as the truth of this case is revealed, please subscribe. Hit the bell so you don't miss anything. Thank you for watching. This video is based on publicly available reporting and official records, recorded interviews and public statements made by identified witnesses, as well as reports from law enforcement authorities. At the time of this production, no one has been formally charged in connection with the disappearance of Lynette Hooker. Brian Hooker denies any wrongdoing, and according to public reports, has fully cooperated with the authorities in the Bahamas. All persons mentioned are presumed innocent of any crime until proven otherwise in a court of law. References to timelines, witness recollections, and physical evidence reflect the public information available at the time of recording. This information may be superseded by later reporting or official findings. The analytical approach to this case, including the question of whether any witness's testimony is inconsistent with other evidence, reflects the editorial perspective of this production and should not be read as a verdict from any investigative body. Viewer discretion is advised.